In this video, I'll be explaining the process of neuron signaling from a presynaptic cell to a postsynaptic cell. So I'll first explain the anatomy of a neuron. The entire neuron is composed of many different parts that all work together as a whole to transmit chemical messages to various parts of the body. The first cell in the transmission of a signal is the presynaptic cell. The postsynaptic cell receives the messages relayed by the presynaptic cell. The various parts of a neuron include the cell body, which houses the nucleus of the cell. From the cell body extend the dendrites of a neuron, and the dendrites are part of a cell that receives the signals. Connected to the cell body at the base is the cell's single axon. This structure is responsible for transmitting the signals to the postsynaptic cell. The axon is attached to the cell body at the axon hillock. At the end of the axon is the synapse. This is the cell junction where the neurotransmitters pass information from the transmitting neuron to the receiving neuron. The synaptic terminal is where the electrical signals pass. The role of ion channels is important in the process of neuron signaling. Every neuron has a membrane potential, which is the charge difference between the outside of the cell and the inside because of an uneven distribution of ions across the membrane. Sodium and potassium ions are unequally distributed across the membrane, resulting in a negative charge inside the cell and a positive charge on the outside. When there is not a lot of activity in the cell is at resting potential. Stimuli cause changes in the neuron's membrane potential, acting as signals and therefore transmit information through the neuron. Ion channels and pumps are the structures that play a role in the concentration of sodium and potassium ions inside and outside the cell. On the axon of the cell, there are structures called sodium and potassium pumps. These pumps are responsible for pumping 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions into the cell. This is what maintains the concentration gradient of sodium and potassium. This pump uses the energy of ATP to actively transport the ions into and out of the cell. Gated ion channels are open or closed in response to stimuli from other sources. The opening or closing of gated ion channels alters the membrane's permeability to certain ions, and this alters the membrane potential. There are sodium channels and potassium channels that open and close at certain times to change the membrane potential of the neuron. These channels do not use active transport, but they use diffusion to move the ions across the concentration gradient. The flow of potassium ions freely across the membrane is essential to establishing the resting potential of the cell. A cell mostly has open potassium channels, but very few of the sodium channels are open. Since sodium ions cannot readily cross the cell membrane, the outflow of potassium leads to a negative net charge inside the cell. During depolarization of a neuron, the resting potential is altered. This is normally due to the gated sodium ion channels. A stimulus coming from another source causes the gates of the sodium channel to open, and the neuron's membrane becomes permeable to sodium. When the sodium diffuses into the membrane, the inside of the cell becomes less negatively charged, and this causes depolarization. The depolarization of the cell results in the action potential of the cell. It uses a positive feedback mechanism to increase the action potential. The synapse is located at the end of an axon, and it is responsible for transmitting the signal from the presynaptic cell to the postsynaptic cell. A message flows from the axon of one neuron to the dendrites of another neuron through synapses between each neuron. A majority of synapses are chemical synapses, which involve the release of a chemical neurotransmitter by the presynaptic neuron. The signal produced through the depolarization of the cell is transmitted to the synapse where the neurotransmitters release it to the dendrites of the postsynaptic cell. Ligand-gated ion channels in the postsynaptic cell's dendrites receive the neurotransmitters. The transmission of the signal ends when the neurotransmitters diffuse out of the synaptic cleft and into the postsynaptic cell. The neurotransmitters can then be taken in by another cell or degraded by an enzyme. Neurotransmitters on postsynaptic neurons. A neurotransmitter may bind specifically to more than a dozen different receptors, including ionotropic and metabotropic types. A certain neurotransmitter can excite postsynaptic cells expressing one receptor and inhibit postsynaptic cells expressing a different receptor. The neurotransmitters are diffused through the ligand-gated ion channels in the postsynaptic neuron. The postsynaptic potential of the cell is the ability of the cell to diffuse transmitters across the selectively permeable membrane. The binding of the neurotransmitter to a particular receptor opens the channel and allows specific ions to diffuse across the postsynaptic membrane. At the end of this process, when another signal is perceived, the action potential starts over again to transmit the signal. And this is the process of neuron signaling.